So the first question we want to answer is, what exactly is reactive programming? So whenever we make an HTTP call, we have to subscribe, and then whenever the response comes back, then our subscription or the code where we have the subscription, in this case where we're console logging the information, this code executes. So that's exactly what reactive programming. It means that it can react to some data stream whenever the data is actually there. In this case, whenever this data is emitted. So that means that we can have some piece of code and we know that it's going to react to some changes later. In this case, whenever we have some data stream that we're expecting and this data or this data stream is there. So the role of the observable that we've been using is to just emit this data to all the observer. And one of the observers in our case was the component that we had, which is why we subscribe to that observable, because we want that observable to propagate this change in data or this stream of data over to us. So that's reactive programming. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And reactive programming deserves a course for itself, but I just want to give you a high-level overview of exactly what that is, so that you better understand later when we start using some of the operators that we're going to use. So reactive programming, it's going to run in a way that it's going to wait for some changes to happen, and then this change is going to propagate like down a chain of observers, if you will. And you usually use this type of programming when you're dealing with asynchronous data stream. Hopefully by now you guys understand when people say asynchronous, it means that it's not gonna happen at the same time as something else. That's the meaning of the word. But in programming, what that means is that you have some piece of code and it's definitely gonna run by itself at some point in time, and it's gonna react to some changes that's gonna happen. And that's usually some data stream. And a very perfect example, which is why it's being used in RxJS and which is why it's being used in Angular, is when you're making an HTTP call. Because we know that whenever you make an HTTP request, unfortunately, you have to wait because there's a whole network that the request has to go through routers and wires, and maybe it's propagating in the air or whatever. And then it has to go to that specific host where the data is. So all this data that we've been using, this data is somewhere on some server or some computer on some network that can be like very, very far away. So whenever we make a request to get this data, it's going to take some time. So we have to create some reactive way so that our code can react whenever this response comes back. So if we send a request over to the server, we know it's going to take some time, but we need to have a way to, get that data or be notified whenever this data is back. And we want to continue running the code because we don't want to stop the code or stop the execution of the program and then wait for the data to come back. That would be like a horrible user experience. So the whole point of creating this type of programming is to come up with a way to make the user experience better. So we're gonna go ahead and run the code, and it's gonna run from top to bottom. But because this code is reactive, it's not gonna block, which means it's asynchronous. So it's gonna happen at a different time or at a later time. And then the code is gonna run. So whatever code that we have, it's gonna run from top to bottom. However, whenever the response comes back, the code is gonna react, which is the reactive part of the reactive programming. And that's what we've been doing with the observable. The observable class that we've been using that I just showed you earlier is just the emitter. So whenever the reaction happens, which means whenever the response comes back, then the observable emits the data, in this case, the HTTP response. And another way to look at it is, you remember in our service, we are waiting for some data. So we need some data that we need in the component, and we want that data to, show some users or something. So the data is gonna come in the service. So whenever the HTTP response comes back, that's the reaction that happens, right? So you can think of this as the reaction in the reactive programming. And then what the observable is gonna do is it's gonna take that data and then emit it. So if we were to show this in a more visual way, so it would be like this. So we have the reaction, which is the HTTP response, and then we have the observable. The observable is the emitter. So it's like it's the guy that's gonna tell everyone, hey, we get some data. So whenever the data comes back, so whenever we get the HTTP response, it's gonna go into the observable, and then the observable is gonna just emit this to our observer. And in that case, that's gonna be our component. And then from this point on, we'll be notified, and then we'll show the data done to the user. And usually might have something like some loading spinner or something to indicate to the user there's work being done in the backend and they just have to wait for some data to come. So you can visualize this way. So you have a reaction, and then whenever this reaction occurs, then you have an observable, and that observable just emits the data to all the observers. And this will bring us to ArcGIS, which we're going to look at next.